They say that Lucian Crowe, the most feared crime boss in all of Chicago, had never once shed a single tear. The man who made the entire underworld bow their heads, who gave orders with a single glance, and ended everything with one slow nod. And yet, on that rainy night, sitting behind the bulletproof glass of a car parked across the street, he could not tear his eyes away from a thin, weary waitress kneeling on the sidewalk, feeding spoonful after spoonful of warm soup to a disabled old woman the whole neighborhood had turned its back on. The young woman had no idea she was being watched. She had no idea who the man in that luxurious car was, and least of all could she have imagined that the face of the old woman she had quietly cared for, month after month, was the very face that powerful man had searched for, in vain, for 20 long years. On one side, a woman who had nothing to her name but a heart that refused to harden. On the other, a man who held everything in his grasp, except for the one thing he had lost in his childhood, and an old, worn-out card, about to be handed over this very night, would pull all three strangers into a whirlwind from which none of them would ever walk away unchanged. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with those who need a little more faith in the goodness of people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so we can bring you a warm and meaningful story like this one every single day. At night, Chicago's West Side was a place where the streetlights flickered between brightness and shadow, where the sound of the elevated train echoed down in steady waves, like the tired breathing of an entire poor neighborhood. On that street stood a small diner called Dorset's Diner, its glass windows blurred with steam, its neon sign blinking unevenly, the last letter long broken and left unrepaired because no one had ever cared enough to fix it. That was where Maggie Sullivan had spent the past 2 years, standing behind the counter every night from the time the sky grew dark until the city sank into its restless sleep. She was 27 years old, thin and worn from work, her hands roughened by carrying plates and washing dishes, yet her eyes still held something gentle that life hadn't managed to take from her. Maggie worked 2 shifts back to back and slept barely 4 hours a day, because there was a little boy waiting for her at home, and because the bills kept piling up on top of one another like a staircase with no end. That little boy was Danny, her younger brother, only 9 years old, carrying inside his chest a heart that wasn't as healthy as other children's. Ever since their mother died, Maggie had been both sister and mother, carrying his childhood on her shoulders, along with the hospital bills that made her heart tighten every time she looked at them. The doctor said Danny's heart had to be watched carefully, that he needed regular medication, and that someday he might need a surgery, whose cost lay far beyond anything a waitress could even dream of. But Maggie didn't allow herself to think that far ahead. She only focused on today, on the shift in front of her, on the small tips that late-night customers sometimes left behind on the tables. That night, when the clock hands moved past 12, the diner had grown quiet. Maggie wiped down the last tables, stacked the chairs, then went into the kitchen in the back. As she did every night, she quietly packed up the leftover food the kitchen would have thrown away if no one took it. A container of soup still warm, a few slices of bread, a little stew that was still perfectly good. She carefully tied the bag shut and placed it in the small basket she carried with her. No one noticed what she was doing, and Maggie didn't want anyone to notice. To her, it was only a small thing, a silent habit she had taken into herself as part of who she was. Before leaving the diner, she took out her phone and called home. From the other end came the clear voice of a little boy who was still awake. "Maggie, are you almost home?" Danny asked, his voice still touched with sleepiness but full of eagerness. "Almost, little man," Maggie said with a smile, leaning back against the kitchen doorway. "You haven't gone to sleep yet? You've got to get up early tomorrow." "I finished my drawing," Danny said proudly. "I drew you and me standing under a really big tree, and there's a sun too. I'll show it to you when you get home, okay?" Hearing that, Maggie felt warmth spread through her heart in the cold of the late-night kitchen. She reminded him to take his medicine on time and go to sleep, then promised that when he woke up in the morning, she'd be home. The little boy chirped his goodbye, then hung up. In that moment, all the weariness of the long day seemed to fade away. The picture of the two of them under a tree with the sun above them was the reason she kept going. It was what kept her heart from hardening, no matter how cruel life became. Maggie pulled her thin coat over her shoulders, picked up the basket of food, pushed open the diner door, and stepped outside. The cold air of the late-night street rushed toward her, but she had long since grown used to it. She began walking quickly along the empty sidewalk, heading toward the road that led to the familiar corner. She didn't know that within her small, cramped, struggling world, she was about to meet again, a quiet figure who had been drawing her attention more than she had realized over these past few nights. And she couldn't possibly have known that the ordinary footsteps of a poor waitress on this night would slowly lead her closer to a truth that could shake her entire life. The story of the old woman on the street corner began on a night just as cold as that one, a few weeks before that fateful night. Along the familiar route from Dorset's to home, there was a hidden corner between two abandoned buildings. A place where the wind always swept through as though it wanted to tear everything away. And it was there, in that shadowed corner, that Maggie first saw her. She was a very old woman, sitting silently in a worn-out wheelchair with one wheel bent out of shape, a thin blanket spread across legs that could no longer move. She didn't raise her hand to beg anyone for money. She didn't cry out in complaint, and she didn't follow any passerby with her eyes. She simply sat there, still as if she had become part of the brick wall behind her, her gaze lowered as though she were trying to shrink herself down as small as possible, as though her very existence were something she had to apologize to the whole world for. Maggie had passed by her for many nights before she truly saw her, because in this West Side neighborhood, people learned very early to turn their faces away from other people's suffering, since everyone had a burden of their own to carry. The people in the neighborhood whispered all kinds of things about the old woman. Some said her family had abandoned her. Others insisted she had lost her mind. One man waiting for the bus even muttered that people like her only made the sidewalk dirty. Maggie heard all of it, and she also noticed the things other people couldn't be bothered to see. The way the woman's thin shoulders trembled each time the night wind blew in, the way her wrinkled hand pulled the thin blanket a little higher though it did almost no good, the way she coughed dryly into the sleeve of her frayed coat so she wouldn't disturb anyone. And on that first night, when the container of still warm chicken soup was still untouched in Maggie's bag, Maggie stopped. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing at all. She simply stepped closer, bent down, and placed the paper container on the small plastic chair beside the woman's wheelchair, right within reach of those trembling hands. The old woman jerked her head up, and in that moment, Maggie caught a heartbreakingly startled look in her eyes, pale gray eyes clouded by the years, yet still shining with something both astonished and wary, as though it had been so long since anyone had stopped because of her that kindness had become something more frightening than comforting. The two of them looked at each other that way for one long moment, neither of them saying a word. Then Maggie only gave a faint nod, a gentle nod meant to say that the meal was hers, with no conditions attached, and no need for any thanks at all. The old woman reached a trembling hand toward the container, but strangely, her other hand remained clenched tight, so tight that the bones of her knuckles showed white beneath her thin skin, clutching some tiny object Maggie couldn't quite make out beneath the dim streetlight. She only saw the dull glint of old metal flashing for an instant between the woman's fingers, a coin worn smooth by time, held close as though it were the last precious thing left from an entire lifetime. Maggie didn't ask. She felt there were some things that belonged to a person and weren't meant for strangers to pry into. She only stood up and said softly that it was cold, and the woman should eat while the food was still warm. Then she quietly walked away, leaving behind the old woman, and the darkness, and the street corner that, from that night on, became a familiar stop on her way home. She didn't know the woman's name. The woman had never said a single word to her either. But something in that woman's long-suffering silence anchored itself inside Maggie's heart, and she told herself that as long as she still had a leftover meal in her hands, she would keep stopping at that corner. In the days that followed, that street corner became part of the rhythm of Maggie's life, and it also became something more than a few people began to talk about. Rosa, the co-worker who worked the night shift with her at Dorset's, was the first to speak up. One night, while the two of them were wiping down the kitchen counter together before closing time, Rosa stopped, looked at Maggie with an expression that was half concern and half frustration, and asked in a lowered voice, as though she were afraid someone might hear, "How long are you planning to keep doing this? I see you stop by that old woman every night. You don't know anything about her. People say she's a fraud, that she sits there pretending to be pitiful so she can wring kindness out of soft-hearted girls like you. What if one night she has accomplices waiting nearby? You've still got Danny at home waiting for you, Maggie. You need to take care of yourself first." Maggie listened without interrupting, her hands still steadily wringing out the cleaning cloth. Then she looked up, her eyes strangely calm. "I know you're worried about me, and I'm grateful for that," she said slowly. "But if she really is tricking me, then all I lose is a container of soup that would have been thrown away anyway. And if she really is hungry, and I turn my face away, then what I lose will be much greater. Being kind isn't the same as being foolish, Rosa. It's the one thing poverty still hasn't managed to take from me. I'd rather be a fool who still knows how to give than a sensible person who lets someone freeze to death right in front of her. Rosa shook her head and sighed, but she said nothing more, because she understood that there are some people you can't argue into defeat, not because they're naive, but because they've chosen a way of living with their whole heart. And just as Rosa had said, Maggie truly didn't know anything about the old woman, but that didn't stop her from continuing to watch over her in many different ways. One night, when rain suddenly came pouring down, water streaming in sheets from the torn awnings, Maggie hurried to the corner and found the old woman hunched in the full force of the storm, her wheelchair unable to roll itself into shelter. Maggie didn't say much. She only moved behind her, used all her strength to push that heavy chair beneath the cover of an empty storefront nearby, then took off her own thin coat and draped it over the woman's trembling shoulders, even though she herself was soaked through on the way home that night. Another time, after several nights of hearing the old woman's cough grow heavier and harsher, that dry, rasping cough echoing from the dark corner, Maggie stopped by the pharmacy at the head of the street the next morning, even though she had only a few small coins left in her wallet for Danny's milk. She bought a bottle of cough syrup and a few cold pills, and that evening, she quietly placed them in the woman's hands, telling her to remember to take them so her body could stay warm. The old woman never answered in words, but there was one very small change that only Maggie noticed. The startled, guarded look in her eyes from the beginning slowly softened, and one night, just as Maggie turned to leave, she felt the woman's thin fingers lightly touch her wrist. It was a fleeting touch, trembling but strangely warm, as though the old woman were trying to say something her mouth had long since forgotten how to shape into sound. Maggie only smiled, placed her own hand over that wrinkled one for a moment, and then left. She didn't need thanks. She never had. To her, kindness wasn't something to be traded for gratitude. It was simply the way she had chosen to walk through this world, even when that world had never once been gentle with her. A few miles from the west side, yet seemingly belonging to an entirely different world, on the highest floor of a glass tower that rose straight into the Chicago sky, Lucian Crowe stood silently beside a wide window, looking down at the whole city spread beneath him like a map crowded with specks of light. At 34, he was tall and solidly built, his face carrying the quiet composure of a man far too accustomed to having others hold their breath while waiting for his every gesture. People said that the entire northern half of the city turned according to his will, from the docks where cargo slipped quietly ashore in the night, to the discreet gambling rooms hidden behind elegant restaurants, and not a single wheel in that underground machine dared to move without Lucian Crowe's nod. That night, in the private meeting room set deep inside the penthouse, a group of the most powerful men in the city's underworld sat around a long table, and the remarkable thing wasn't that they were there, but the way they behaved when Lucian walked in. All of them fell silent at once. A few lowered their heads as if trying to avoid his gaze, because everyone understood that in this room, the man who spoke the most was often the man who left the earliest. Lucian sat down at the head of the table, unhurried and without raising his voice. He didn't need to bite out each word to make people afraid. His coldness had been doing that for him for a long time. Standing just behind his chair was Wesley, the man who had walked beside Lucian for nearly 15 years, the right hand he trusted more than anyone else alive. Wesley had the face of a man who always knew when to smile, a voice gentle enough to soothe people, and a mind cold enough to handle the things Lucian didn't want to touch with his own hands. Throughout the meeting, Wesley was the one who repeated every number, every name, every business connection, while Lucian only listened, occasionally letting fall one brief sentence that made the whole table nod and obey. But that night, one name was mentioned, and it made the air in the room grow heavy. Gideon Vance. A rising figure from the other side of the city, ambitious and as ruthless as any man there, he was pushing deeper and deeper into the northern dock territory that had belonged to Lucian for years. One of the men sitting at the far end of the table timidly reported that Gideon's people had begun collecting protection money in the bordering districts, openly challenging the unspoken laws Lucian had spent so many years building. Hearing that, Lucian didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't lose his temper. He only turned the glass in his hand slowly, his sharp, cold gaze sweeping once around the table. And then he spoke, his voice low and even, like still water before a storm. "Gideon Vance wants to test whether I still have teeth," he said. "Then let him come a little closer." The man who walks too confidently into another man's house is the one who most easily forgets the way out. The entire table went still. Then everyone nodded at once, and no one dared ask another word. Wesley bent close to his ear and murmured something about tightening security at the key locations, and Lucian answered only with a slight nod. When the meeting ended, the men left one by one in silence, leaving Lucian alone in that vast room. He rose, returned to the glass window, and looked down at the city he held in the palm of his hand. He had everything a man could desire: power that made others bow their heads, money so abundant it had lost all meaning, and a name that was enough to make people cautious the moment it was spoken. And yet on quiet nights like this, when the whole empire was asleep beneath his feet, Lucian Crowe still felt an emptiness somewhere inside his chest, a cold, hollow place that no power or gold could ever fill, as though long ago he had lost something he himself no longer dared to name. A few days after that meeting, a piece of news made its way to Lucian's ears, not about Gideon Vance, but about one of his own men. In the North Dock District, where hundreds of poor workers sweated each night unloading cargo for meager wages, a manager named Briggs, a low-level subordinate Lucian had assigned to oversee the area, had been quietly squeezing those miserable laborers dry for months. He had been holding back part of their pay, inventing unreasonable fines, threatening to fire anyone who dared open his mouth to complain, and pocketing the difference while still sending clean, polished reports up the chain. Lucian learned the truth from a trembling old dock worker who didn't dare look him in the eye, a man who had risked speaking up only because his little grandchild at home had gone several days without enough money for medicine. Lucian said nothing after hearing it. He only gave a slight nod for the old man to leave, then turned to Wesley and dropped one brief sentence. "Call him to the docks. Tonight." When night fell and the dockyard lay empty except for the heavy slap of waves against the concrete pillars, the manager was brought before Lucian. He was still laughing, still thinking he had been summoned to discuss business, until he saw the crime lord's eyes and the smile died on his lips. Lucian stood there with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his calm so complete it was frightening, and when he spoke, his voice didn't rise at all, but every word fell like stone. "I hear you've been doing very well for yourself here," he said. "So well that you forgot the money in your pocket was paid for with the sweat of people who had no one to call for help. Do you know what I hate most in this world?" The manager stammered, trying to explain himself, but Lucian lifted one finger, and the man fell silent, as though a hand had closed around his throat. "I hate strong men who prey on those weaker than themselves," Lucian went on, each word colder than the last. "This world already has enough ways to force poor people to their knees. They don't need one more worm like you gnawing away at the little they have left." He gave a faint tilt of his head, and his men moved forward, decisive and silent. There were no long screams, no bloody spectacle, only the absolute pressure of a power that didn't forgive. Within moments, the manager who had once swaggered around bullying others was dragged away in utter terror, stripped of everything he had stolen, and pushed out of Lucian's world forever. A punishment everyone in the underworld understood was more frightening than almost anything else. The next morning, the money the manager had taken was returned in full to every worker, along with a short message saying that from now on, no one would dare touch what put food on their tables again. None of those laborers knew the face of the man who had acted on their behalf. They only knew that on that night, some invisible law had stood on the side of those with the weakest voices. As for Lucian, as he stood watching the first light of dawn spill across the harbor water, he quietly lit a cigarette, and for a moment, the memory of his own hungry childhood came flooding back, those days when he, too, had been a thin little boy with nothing in his hands, when he, too, had known what it felt like to be trampled by the strong with no one there to defend him. Perhaps that was why, inside a man who had become so ruthless, there still remained one private law he would never break, that no matter what else he did, he would never become the kind of man who bullied those weaker than himself. That night, rain came pouring down, a stubborn rain lashing the streets of the west side as though it meant to wash the whole city clean, and after finishing a business matter in that district, Lucian's car pulled over to the curb to wait for Wesley to return from a nearby building. He sat silently behind the bulletproof glass, the streetlights smearing through the sheet of water running down the window, casting twisted streaks of brightness across his face. And while he waited, his eyes, so accustomed to looking at the city with cold calculation, happened to settle on the other side of the street. Beneath the awning of an old building, he saw a small figure kneeling on the soaked sidewalk. It was a thin young woman in a flimsy coat, already heavy with rain, her hair clinging wetly to her head, and she was bending beside a wheelchair, patiently feeding spoonful after spoonful of something still steaming to the person sitting there, paying no attention at all to the rain streaming down her back. Lucian couldn't see the person in the wheelchair clearly, because the chair was turned away from him, and the torn umbrella the young woman was trying to hold as shelter hid most of that figure from view. He could only make out a hunched body beneath a thin blanket, and a pair of trembling hands reaching out to receive each spoonful of food. But it was the young woman who made it impossible for him to look away. In the city where Lucian had lived his whole life, a city where every person hurried after some private advantage, where kindness was often only another commodity to be measured and priced, the sight of a poor young woman kneeling in the cold rain to care for someone the whole world had turned away from, asking for nothing, displaying nothing, was so strange it felt almost unreal. He had seen too many lies dressed up as charity, too many people doing good only because someone was watching, so he sat there in silence and observed, waiting for the moment when the young woman would look up in search of an approving gaze, a hand extended for a little payment, some sign that calculation was hidden behind the act. But that moment never came. The young woman only went quietly about what she was doing, carefully wiping the corner of the wheelchair-bound person's mouth with the hem of her own shirt, then pulling the thin blanket higher to keep that person a little warmer. She did it all so naturally, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, as though there were no camera, no witness, and no need for anyone to know. And in that very moment, a moment that should have seemed small and ordinary, something very strange happened inside the chest of a man who had long prided himself on no longer being moved by anything. Lucian felt a brief ache in the heart he had believed hardened long ago, a vague feeling he couldn't give a name to, both foreign and painfully familiar, as though the scene before him had brushed against some memory he had buried so deeply that he had almost forgotten it altogether. He didn't understand why such an ordinary sight in a poor neighborhood could make him, a man used to giving orders to the entire underworld, sit perfectly still for several long minutes. When Wesley returned to the car, opened the door, and brushed the rain from his shoulders, Lucian's eyes were still fixed through the window, and he spoke softly, his voice lower than usual. "That girl," he said, tilting his head slightly toward the other side of the street. "Find out who she is, her name, where she lives, what she does. I want to know everything." Wesley glanced outside, his brow tightening slightly at such a strange request from his boss, but he only nodded and asked no questions. The car rolled away through the rain, leaving that street corner behind, and Lucian leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. But the image of the young woman kneeling in the rain kept returning again and again in his mind, and he couldn't drive it away. A few nights later, the image of the young woman kneeling in the rain still wouldn't let Lucian go. And then one evening, he told the driver to slow down as they passed that very street corner. This time, the rain had stopped, the air was clearer, and the streetlight fell much more sharply over everything below. The girl from that night wasn't there, but the person sitting in the wheelchair was still there, and this time, there was no umbrella hiding her, no curtain of rain blurring her shape. The chair had been turned slightly to one side, allowing the face of the elderly woman to appear clearly for the first time beneath the sickly yellow light. Lucian told the driver to stop. He didn't know why he did it. There was only a strange urge inside him, pushing him to look more closely at the person that girl had been caring for. He lowered the car window a little, his eyes crossing the distance of the empty street, and in that very instant, the old woman moved slightly, lifting one wrinkled hand to brush a lock of silver hair away from her forehead. In that open palm, beneath the light, a small metal object flashed with a dull gleam, an old coin, worn nearly smooth, clutched as though it were a treasure. Lucian froze. Something about that coin, about the way that aged hand held it so carefully, reached straight into a deep place inside him that he had believed was sealed forever. He leaned forward, his heart pounding in a strange, urgent rhythm, and when his gaze traveled from the coin to the woman's face, to that forehead, to those gray eyes clouded by time, to the small mole near the corner of her eye that he had stared at thousands of times when he was a boy, the whole world around him seemed to turn still. It was her, the face that had lulled him to sleep through the long, cold nights of his childhood, the hands that had once wiped away his tears when no one else in the world was willing to do it, the only woman who had ever loved him without condition before life turned him into the man he was today. Eleanor, his nanny, the woman who had vanished from his life without a word of farewell when he was still a boy, the woman he had quietly had people searching for all over the place for the past 20 years without finding even a single clue, the woman he had both hated and missed so deeply that he hadn't dared speak her name, because he had believed she had abandoned him, believed that even the gentlest person he had ever known had finally turned her back on him like everyone else. And yet she was here, right before his eyes, old, disabled, curled up on a poor street corner in the very city he ruled, hungry and ignored by the world, surviving on the kindness of a strange girl, while the child she had once cared for sat behind bulletproof glass, only a few steps away from her. Some sharp, unbearable pain rose and lodged in Lucian's chest, a feeling so powerful that he couldn't breathe, and for the first time in so many years, the man the entire underworld whispered had never shed a single tear, felt his eyes grow hot, stinging, and blurred. He clenched his fist so tightly that it trembled, his nails digging into his palm, trying to hold back the feeling threatening to spill over. A feeling he had forgotten long ago. The driver quietly asked whether he wanted to get out, but Lucian couldn't answer. He only sat there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the small figure of the old woman through the car window, not daring to step out, yet unable to turn away. So many questions crashed into his mind all at once. Why was she here? Why had she ended up like this? Why had she left him all those years ago? And why, after all those years of searching in vain, had fate chosen to lead him back to her through the hands of a poor girl whose name he didn't even know yet? That night, the car remained parked at that street corner for a very long time, and Lucian Crowe sat there in the darkness, silent and unmoving, letting the first tears in 20 years slide down a face that had never known how to cry. Sitting in the darkness of the car, with the old woman's face before his eyes, Lucian felt himself being pulled backward into the farthest years of his life, back to the time when he was still a thin little boy named Lucian, living in a cramped house on the edge of the city, a house that had never truly felt like a safe place to him. In the memory of that boy, the house was always filled with a heavy kind of silence, and with sounds that made his heart tighten every time the front door swung open late at night, a place where he learned to fold himself into dark corners, learned to read anger before it arrived by the sound of footsteps, learned to become invisible just so he could be left alone. His father was a man he both feared and could never understand, and his mother had left when he was still too young, leaving him alone in that unsteady world. But through all those dark years, there was one person who became his only light. That person was Eleanor, the woman hired to look after him, the nanny with warm hands and a voice so gentle that simply hearing it was enough to make the boy stop trembling. Whenever the house became so suffocating he could hardly breathe, she was the one he ran to. She was the pair of arms he burrowed into. She was the one who pulled him out of dark corners and soothed him by telling him that everything would be all right. She cooked warm meals for him when no one else cared whether he had eaten or not. She sat beside his bed and told him stories until he drifted into sleep. And more important than anything else, she was the one who planted the first lessons of kindness inside his young heart. She taught him that no matter how harsh life became, a person could still choose to treat others gently, that true strength didn't lie in making people afraid, but in making them feel safe. She often held his hand and told him he was a good child, that there was a light inside him no one could put out, and the little boy had believed her. He had clung to her words the way a drowning person clings to the only lifeline in the sea. One afternoon, she placed an old coin, worn nearly smooth, into his tiny palm, and told him it was a lucky charm she had guarded all her life. Now, she wanted to give it to him, so that no matter what happened later, he would always remember that there had once been someone who loved him without condition. The boy had closed his small hand tightly around that coin, not fully understanding what her words meant, only knowing that it was the most precious gift he had ever received. Then one morning, he woke up, and she was no longer there. No note, no farewell, no warning sign at all. The boy waited all that day, then the next day, then many days after that, sitting curled beside the window and watching for the familiar figure he was certain would return. But she never came back. He asked, but no one gave him an answer, and little by little, inside the heart of a child who had nothing but abandonment, a silent wound began to form and grow with him through the years. The boy Lucian believed, bitterly and completely, that even the gentlest person, the person he loved most, had finally turned away and left him, that maybe he wasn't worth anyone staying for. And it was that shattered belief, that feeling of rejection carved deep into his young soul, that slowly forged him into someone else, someone who built cold walls around his heart, someone determined never to let himself be weak again. For 20 years, that old coin was the only thing Lucian had kept from her, the silent proof of a love he had stopped believing was real. Even though his heart had been shaken so violently, Lucian was still the man 20 years in the underworld had forged, and his first instinct wasn't trust, but suspicion. He had witnessed too many elaborate performances, too many people staging moving little dramas for profit, to swallow the idea that a strange young woman could be kind to Eleanor with no hidden purpose at all. Perhaps that girl had realized the old woman was connected to someone powerful and was setting a trap. Perhaps that kindness was only the first step in some deeper scheme he hadn't yet seen through, and so he called Wesley in and ordered him to investigate the girl thoroughly, to leave nothing out, to dig into every corner of her life until he found the hidden motive Lucian was certain had to exist. Wesley did his work silently and meticulously, the way he always did, and after only a few days, a thin file was placed on Lucian's desk. The girl's name was Maggie Sullivan. She was 27 years old, worked the night shift as a waitress at a small diner called Dorset's, and took extra work during the day at a laundromat just to patch together a living. Her mother was dead, and she was raising her 9-year-old younger brother, Danny, all on her own, a boy with a diseased heart that kept hospital bills piling up into a mountain of debt that her wages made almost hopeless to repay. The more Lucian read, the deeper his frown became, not because he had found anything suspicious, but because he had found the exact opposite. His people had watched her for many days and discovered that the girl had no idea who Eleanor was, had no connection at all to his world, and didn't have the faintest clue that the old woman she cared for every night was tied to a man with such power. She helped Eleanor simply because she couldn't do otherwise, even when there were only a few small bills left in her own pocket, even when she herself was struggling beneath the weight of her own life every single day, even when stopping at that street corner each night brought her nothing but cold and the gossip of other people. Lucian sat for a long time with the file in his hands, and the walls of suspicion he had built began to crack little by little. So there was still such a thing in this world as kindness without reason, a kind of decency that asked for nothing in return, exactly as Eleanor had taught him when he was a boy, back when he had long since stopped believing in it. That poor girl, without knowing it, had lived fully by the very lesson his nanny had once tried to plant inside his heart. A strange emotion rose inside Lucian, part respect, part quiet tenderness, though he didn't want to admit it. He closed the file, sat in silence for a while, and then made a decision. He called Wesley in and quietly ordered him to pay off every last dollar of Danny's hospital debt, to clear it completely without leaving a cent unpaid. But under no circumstances was any name to be revealed, not one word, not one trace. Wesley looked slightly surprised, but he still nodded and obeyed. After the man had left, Lucian returned to the familiar glass window and looked down over the city. This time, inside his chest, there was no longer only that cold emptiness he knew so well, but something both warm and aching, as though a door that had been sealed shut for 20 years had begun to open again, and behind that door was a part of himself he had believed he'd lost long ago. But there was one thing Lucian hadn't foreseen, and that was that the very man he trusted most was quietly watching him with an entirely different gaze. Wesley had walked beside Lucian for nearly 15 years, long enough to understand his boss better than anyone else, and also long enough to notice that lately, something very unusual had been happening. The cold man Wesley had once believed could no longer be moved by anything had suddenly ordered the driver more than once to circle through the poor West Side, had suddenly asked personally for an investigation into some insignificant waitress, and then had quietly spent a considerable sum paying off the hospital debt of a strange child, without giving anyone a reason. To a cunning man like Wesley, those scattered pieces gradually revealed a very interesting picture, and in his mind, a dangerous thought began to take root. He secretly had men follow Lucian's hidden trips, and before long, he traced them back to the street corner where the disabled old woman still sat, traced them back to the girl named Maggie, and most important of all, he pieced together that the elderly woman wasn't some ordinary beggar, but a link to the crime lord's past. A past Lucian had hidden so deeply that even Wesley, after all those years, had never been allowed to know it. He didn't need to understand the whole story. He only needed to understand one thing, that the most powerful man in Chicago, the man who seemed to have no weakness at all, did have one after all, and that weakness wore the shape of a crippled old woman and a poor girl. In the world Wesley lived in, information like that was worth more than gold, and the greed inside him, The greed he had cleverly hidden for years beneath the appearance of loyalty now rose up with a force nothing could stop. He was tired of standing behind another man. He was sick of spending his whole life as the loyal shadow of someone he secretly believed he was in no way inferior to. And so one night, in a dark bar on the outskirts of town, Wesley secretly sat across from Gideon Vance. The enemy Lucian was watching with caution. Gideon looked at him with the suspicious eyes of a hunting beast and asked why Crowe's trusted right-hand man had come to him, and Wesley merely curved his lips into a smile, pushing a stack of secretly taken photographs across the table. Photographs of the old woman and the girl on the street corner. Every person, no matter how strong, has a thread that, if pulled the right way, will make the whole cloth come apart, Wesley said, his voice soft but chilling enough to run down the spine. Lucian Crowe has kept me standing in the shadows for 15 years. It's time for me to stand in the light, and you're going to help me do that. I'm giving you the thread, and you know what to do with it. Gideon picked up the stack of photographs, and a greedy, poisonous glint lit in his eyes as he recognized the opportunity being handed directly to him. For so long, he had been trying to bring Lucian down without ever finding an opening, because that man was too careful, too cold, with no wife, no children, no close friends, seemingly nothing to lose. And yet now, a crack had appeared, and it was more valuable than anything Gideon had dared to dream of. He filled 2 glasses with liquor, raised one toward Wesley with a calculating smile, and in the moment when the 2 traitors touched glasses in the darkness, the fates of Eleanor, Maggie, and Lucian himself were silently pushed toward a dangerous turning point that none of those 3 innocent souls knew anything about. The wolf had caught the scent of blood, and it wouldn't stop until it had torn into its prey. While those dark schemes were quietly unfolding in the shadows, Maggie went on living her days without knowing anything at all, until one morning, a phone call from the hospital nearly made her drop the cup she was holding. They were calling to tell her that Danny's entire hospital debt, that enormous sum that had weighed on her shoulders for so many months and years and had stolen sleep from her on more nights than she could count, had been paid in full. Maggie stood frozen, certain she must have heard wrong, and had to ask again and again several times. She asked who had paid it, but the voice on the other end of the line only said the person wished to remain anonymous and hadn't left any information behind. She lowered the phone, both hands trembling, and a storm of feeling rose inside her, both a relief so overwhelming that tears spilled out before she could stop them, and a confusion she couldn't put into words, because in all her life, no one had ever given her anything for free. She had never dared believe that kindness that large could simply find its way to someone like her. Then, after that first wave of emotion, a vague thread of fear slipped into her mind, because she had lived long enough in that neighborhood to understand that few gifts in this world came without a price attached, and she wondered who that hidden benefactor was, why they had done such a thing, and whether one day they would come back and ask something of her. But no matter how confused she was, when her shift ended that night, Maggie's feet still carried her by habit toward the familiar street corner, and it was there that another worry, nearer and more heartbreaking, was waiting for her. The old woman looked very different tonight. Her face was paler, her thin shoulders seemed to have caved in even farther, and her breathing sounded heavy, broken by each faint cough. Maggie quickly knelt beside her, placed a hand on her forehead, and felt a frightening fragility in that small body, as though the flame of life inside her were slowly fading, and she no longer cared to hold on to it. Flustered, Maggie began to say she would take her to a doctor, but the old woman gave a slight shake of her head, and then, for the first time since the day they had met, her wrinkled hand reached out on its own and took Maggie's hand, squeezing it gently with all the strength she had left. She lifted her cloudy gray eyes and looked at Maggie for a long time, her gaze filled with a deep feeling Maggie couldn't fully read, and in a hoarse voice, trembling like wind slipping through a crack in a door, she spoke, the first words she had ever spoken to her. "My good girl," she whispered, "you don't know what you've done for this old life of mine. You've treated a strange old woman with more kindness than the people who should have done so. I've lived too long enough to know that souls like yours are the rarest thing in this world. Promise me one thing, no matter how life treats you in the days to come, don't ever let your heart turn hard, because that very heart of yours, one day, will give back to you far more than anything you can imagine." Maggie listened to those words as tears stung the bridge of her nose. She didn't fully understand why the old woman was saying things that sounded like a farewell, why there was something in her voice that carried the shadow of an approaching parting. She only held the woman's hand tighter, nodded her promise, and tried to swallow the dark foreboding rising in her chest, never knowing that ahead of her, a truth greater than anything she could possibly imagine was waiting to be revealed. Across the city, Gideon Vance sat in his private office, turning over the stack of photographs Wesley had given him, and a sinister plan slowly took shape inside his cold mind. He understood all too well that facing Lucian Crowe head-on was unthinkable, because around that crime lord there was always a wall of men and a defense system that had already broken the bones and crushed the lives of many before him who had tried to tear it down. But now, he had in his hands the one thing he had been missing all this time, a weakness, and a clever predator never strikes where the prey is strongest, but aims for the softest place, the place it hasn't had time to protect. Gideon decided he wouldn't touch Lucian, at least not yet. Instead, he would slowly tighten the rope around the girl named Maggie, turn her into a card to be used for control, into bait to lure the tiger out of its den. And to do that without making it obvious, he used a pawn he already had in place, a man named Frank Doyle, who, by coincidence, was the shift manager at Dorset's, the diner where Maggie worked, a greedy, cowardly man who had been quietly taking Gideon's money for a long time to serve as his eyes and ears in that district. A few days later, the atmosphere at Dorset's began to change. Frank, who until then had only known how to bark at employees to make himself look important, suddenly started watching Maggie in an unusual way. He began finding excuses to keep her after work, making things difficult for her in every possible way, cutting her hours. And then one evening, when the diner had emptied of customers, he blocked her path in the corner of the kitchen with a greasy smile on his lips. "Maggie, you're a smart woman. I believe you understand how things work," Frank said, his voice thick with implication. "There are powerful people keeping an eye on you, and all they need is for you to cooperate a little, to provide a few small pieces of information, to tell them about that old woman you're always taking care of, about anyone who has come to see you lately. In return, you'll have more money than you've ever dreamed of, enough for you and that sickly little brother of yours to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. And if you refuse, then I'm afraid your already difficult life is going to become much more difficult." Maggie stood up straight, even though a cold fear was rising inside her, but she didn't let it show on her face. She looked directly into Frank's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was so calm that even she was surprised by it. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to know," she answered. "But I do know one thing. That old woman is a human being, not some piece of merchandise for me to sell in exchange for your money. I've lived my whole life with nothing in my hands, but the one thing I can be proud of is that I've never sold out someone who trusted me. You keep your money, Frank, and I'll keep my conscience." When Frank heard that, his face darkened, the false smile disappearing and giving way to the true malice underneath. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in a threat, warning her that she would regret being so stubborn, that there were powers behind this she couldn't even imagine, and that she was only a tiny ant with no way to fight back. But Maggie didn't step away. She took off her apron, laid it on the counter, and said that if working there meant betraying her own conscience, then she would rather quit. Then she lifted her head and walked out of the diner into the night, leaving behind the man who stood grinding his teeth in fury. Walking down the dark street, Maggie knew she had just pushed herself into a dangerous situation, that she had just lost the income she badly needed, and that the people behind Frank wouldn't let her go easily. But she also knew there were certain things that, once sold, could never be bought back, and her dignity was one of them. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't falter. She only clenched her hands and kept walking, with no idea that the net being cast around her was far wider and far more ruthless than she could ever have imagined. What neither Frank nor the people behind him knew was that Lucian had been quietly watching Maggie from a distance all along. And that night, his men reported every single thing that had happened inside Dorset's. When he heard that some petty manager had dared threaten the girl, had dared use Eleanor herself as a bargaining chip, a cold anger surged inside Lucian, the kind of anger more frightening than any shout because it was silent and absolute. He had the car driven straight to the west side, and just as Maggie had walked a short distance down the dark street, a luxurious car glided silently up beside her and stopped. The door opened, and for the first time, Maggie came face to face with the man she had never met, yet strangely felt had been somewhere around the edges of her life for a long time. He stepped out, tall, calm, clothed in a kind of power she could feel even before he spoke a single word. Maggie took one wary step back, But the man's voice sounded low and strangely gentle. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said. "I didn't come here to hurt you. Quite the opposite." He introduced himself by name alone, without revealing his true identity, and told her that he knew what Frank had done, knew about the pressure she was being forced to carry, and that from tonight on, no one would dare touch her again. Maggie looked at him with both suspicion and confusion in her eyes. She asked who he was, why someone like him would care about someone as ordinary as her, and Lucian only fell silent for a moment before answering that there are certain debts in this world a person must repay, even when the person who owes them doesn't know it. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness hidden beneath that cold exterior, that made her believe he wasn't a bad man. That very night, Frank Doyle was escorted by Lucian's men to a deserted place. He walked in with his usual swagger, until he realized who he was standing before, and his whole body immediately went pale. Lucian didn't need to raise his voice. He only moved slowly closer, his gaze sharp as a blade as it fixed on the man trembling in front of him, and in a frighteningly even voice, he told Frank that daring to threaten someone under his protection was the final mistake in his miserable little career. The manager stammered and begged, trying to shift all the blame onto the people who had been pulling his strings, but it was already too late. Lucian's men stepped forward, and within moments, Frank, who had once boasted and bullied the weak, was stripped of every small scrap of power he had clung to, forced out of the city with a warning that if he ever dared come near it again, he wouldn't be treated so gently next time. There was no bloody spectacle, only the absolute force of a power that didn't forgive, enough to terrify him so completely that he would never dare breathe a word. Meanwhile, at the familiar street corner not far away, something Lucian didn't know about was quietly unfolding. Eleanor, from within the darkness, had seen him. She saw that tall figure step down from the expensive car, heard that low voice that even after 20 years she could never forget, and her old heart seemed to stop beating. It was her boy, the child she had once lulled to sleep, protected, and been forced to leave behind all those years ago, now grown into the powerful man standing there. A tear slid down her wrinkled face, carrying both the overwhelming joy of knowing he was still alive and had grown up, and a heartbreak so deep it nearly tore her apart, because she knew exactly why she had to avoid him, knew the secret she had kept hidden all her life, and quietly, she withdrew deeper into the shadows, swallowing back the aching desire to call his name, so he wouldn't see her. Only a few nights later, Eleanor's health collapsed so quickly that Maggie had no time to prepare herself. She found the old woman nearly spent at the street corner, her breath as fragile as a thread about to snap, and she hurriedly brought her back to her small rented room, laid her on Maggie's own bed, and stayed awake all night beside her to care for her. The old woman knew her time was running out, and during one rare night of clarity, she took Maggie's hand and motioned for her to sit closer, because what she was about to say was something she had buried for an entire lifetime. "My good girl, I have to tell you a story before I no longer have the chance," she whispered, her gray eyes glimmering in the darkness of the room. And then, in a broken voice, she told Maggie about a boy she had once cared for many years ago, a boy who lived in a powerful family but was surrounded by danger, a child she had loved as though he were her own flesh and blood. She told her that back then, a terrible tragedy had fallen upon that family, a dark conspiracy involving powerful and ruthless people, and in that storm, someone needed to place the blame on another person, to cut off the trail, to protect their filthy secrets. The easiest person to turn into a sacrifice was the boy, an innocent child who had no way to protect himself. "I stood before a choice," she said, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. "Either I let them put everything on that boy's head and destroy his whole life before he had even had the chance to grow up, or I stepped forward and took it all upon myself. I chose the second path. I accepted a guilt that wasn't mine. I let them send me far away, with only one condition, that they had to leave the boy in peace. And I had to disappear that very night, without a farewell, because if I had said goodbye to him, I would never have had the courage to walk away. And if I had stayed even one more minute, the entire agreement would have fallen apart, and the boy would have been in danger. I let him believe I had abandoned him, even though my heart was breaking, because it was the only way I could save him." She stopped, gasping for breath, then went on to tell Maggie that for the next 20 years, though she had lived in poverty and illness, though she had drifted from place to place, and finally worn down into a disabled old woman, forgotten on street corners and back alleys, she hadn't gone a single day without watching over her boy from afar. She had quietly followed every step of his growth through scraps of news, had known that he had become a powerful and cold man, and her heart had been both proud and wounded, because she understood that her leaving all those years ago had helped turn him into the closed-off man he was today. "I came to this city not to ask him for anything," she said, her voice choking. "I only wanted to be near him one more time before I closed my eyes. But when I saw what he had become, I didn't have the courage to appear before him. I was afraid my presence would only reopen an old wound, or worse, drag him back into the very past I had sacrificed everything to bury." Then, with trembling hands, she took from inside her old coat a card yellowed by the years, folded and preserved with great care, and placed it in Maggie's hand. "I don't have much time left, child," she said. "I'm begging you for one last thing. Find the man named Lucian Crowe, the man who came to see you the other night, and place this card directly in his hands. Inside it is everything I never had the chance to say. Tell him that I never, not even for 1 second, stopped loving him." Maggie pressed the card to her chest, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the strange invisible thread that had connected all of them. And she gripped the old woman's hand tightly, promising with all her heart that she would do it, no matter what price she had to pay. While Maggie held the card against her chest with the weight of that promise heavy in her heart, on the other side of the darkness, Gideon Vance and Wesley were ready to strike their decisive blow. Wesley, as Lucian's right hand, knew every schedule, every habit, every weak point in his boss's defenses, and he had handed all of that precious information to Gideon like a man throwing open the city gates from within. Their plan was simple and vicious. They knew that Maggie had now become the thread tying Lucian to his past, the only weakness of a man who seemed to have nothing left to lose. So they decided to kidnap her and use her as bait, to lure the crime lord out of his safe ground and make him walk willingly into the trap already waiting for him. Later that evening, just as Maggie was returning from the hospital after visiting Danny, Gideon's men stopped her in an empty alley. She fought back. She screamed, but she was only one lonely young woman against brutal men, and they quickly overpowered her and took her to an abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district. The one thing worth saying was that, throughout the entire dark plan, not one of them dared touch Danny, because the boy was lying safely in the hospital, being cared for and kept entirely outside the cruel world his sister had accidentally been drawn into. And that was the one thing that allowed Maggie, even in the panic of being held captive, to keep some small measure of calm, knowing that at least her little brother was still safe. News that Maggie had been taken reached Lucian quickly, and with it came a truth that hurt him even more deeply than the fact that she was in danger. As he followed the clues, as he pieced together how his enemies had learned far too much information that should have remained absolutely secret, Lucian was stunned to realize that the man who had betrayed him, the man who had sold him out to Gideon, was none other than Wesley, the man who had stood beside him for 15 years, the man he had trusted more than anyone else still living in this world. The feeling of being betrayed by the person closest to him struck Lucian like a knife driven into his back, cold and piercing to the bone, because in a life crowded with enemies and schemes, Wesley had been one of the very few people before whom Lucian had ever lowered his shield. For one moment, that pain almost drowned him, dragging back the old feeling of abandonment, the old wound of believing that even the person one trusted most would eventually turn away. But Lucian was no longer the helpless boy he had once been, and this time, he wouldn't allow himself to collapse. He knew very well that Maggie's abduction was a trap set to draw him in. He knew Gideon and Wesley were waiting at the other end with all their forces. He knew rushing there was no different from placing his own head inside the tiger's jaws. Any cold strategist would have advised him not to go, would have told him that one poor girl wasn't worth risking his entire empire and his life. But Lucian thought of the young woman kneeling in the rain to care for Eleanor without asking for anything in return. He thought of the way she had held on to her dignity in the face of bribery and threats. He thought of how she was in danger now only because her innocent kindness had accidentally brushed against the darkness of his world, and he understood that if he chose to turn his back this time, if he chose safety instead of charging in to save that decent girl, then he would forever become exactly the kind of man Eleanor had sacrificed her whole life to keep him from becoming. And so, setting aside every calculation of loss and gain, setting aside even the fresh, aching pain of betrayal, Lucian wrapped himself in the cold composure of a beast about to enter battle, gathered the people who were still loyal to him, and set out for the old harbor district in the darkness of night, ready to walk straight into the waiting trap to reclaim the girl who had lit in his hardened heart a kind of light he had believed had gone out long ago. The abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district lay drowned in darkness, with only a few sickly yellow lights falling over the damp concrete floor, and it was there that Maggie was tied to a chair in the middle of the wide room, surrounded by Gideon's men. But even though she was being held inside a ring of danger, she didn't collapse or beg them to spare her life. She lifted her head high, her steady eyes looking straight at Gideon, and when he came closer and let his threats fall over her, she answered in a voice so calm it made him pause. "You can tie my hands, but you can't make me afraid," she said. "I've spent my whole life getting pushed down by powerful people, and I've learned that the ones who have to use ropes and guns to make others submit are the weakest ones of all." Gideon gave a cold laugh at that stubborn courage, but deep inside, he couldn't help feeling unsettled, because he realized this girl wasn't the easy prey he had imagined he could break. Just then, from beyond the great doors, Lucian appeared with the most loyal of his men, and the air inside the warehouse instantly grew thick, stretched tight as a drawn wire. Gideon stood behind Maggie, using her as a shield, smiling in triumph because he believed the tiger had walked willingly into the trap. Wesley was there too, standing beside Gideon with a look that was both smug and evasive, unable to meet the eyes of the man he had betrayed. Lucian swept his gaze across the room, and when his eyes touched Wesley, an entire sea of buried emotion surfaced for one brief moment before being forced back down behind his familiar coldness. 15 years, Lucian said, his voice low and cutting. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Wesley tried to curve his mouth into an arrogant smile, and answered that loyalty was nothing compared with opportunity. But his voice was no longer as steady as it had been before. Then everything happened very quickly. Gideon ordered his men to attack, and a violent struggle erupted in the dark warehouse. Lucian's men, hardened and loyal, swiftly overpowered Gideon's scattered thugs, and in the middle of that chaos, Lucian moved straight toward Maggie with one purpose only: to free her. Maggie, refusing to sit still and wait to be saved, had been quietly rubbing the rope around her wrists against the sharp edge of the chair all this time. And just as Gideon was distracted by the fight, she gathered all her strength, snapped the loosened rope apart, and rolled away from his reach. Gideon lunged forward to grab her again, but Lucian had already rushed in and placed himself between him and the girl, and the two enemies finally faced each other. Their confrontation was brief but fierce, and Lucian's strength, along with his cold, calculating precision, quickly drove Gideon into defeat. He was thrown down and disarmed, all his reckless ambition collapsing in an instant. Wesley, seeing that the situation had turned against him, panicked and tried to find a way to escape. But traitors never run far, and he was stopped by the very people he had once looked down on, forced to face the ending that waits for every man who sells out someone who trusted him, a complete fall, stripped of everything and cast out of the world he had traded his own character to climb into. There was no long, bloody spectacle, only the decisive end of those who had sown the wind, and when everything settled, Gideon and his men were fully subdued, their conspiracy scattered into smoke. Lucian turned back, and amid the wreckage of that cruel plot, he hurried to Maggie's side, his eyes, usually cold as ice, now bright, with a worry he himself could no longer hide. He helped her to her feet and asked whether she was hurt, and Maggie, though her whole body was still trembling after everything she had endured, looked up at him and gave a slight nod. In that moment, among the ruins of a vicious scheme, two people from the most distant worlds suddenly understood that fate had bound them together with a thread no force could ever cut. Gideon Vance was now on his knees on the cold warehouse floor, stripped of all power and weapons, lifting fear-filled eyes toward the man standing like a tower before him. By the ordinary rules of the world they both belonged to, by the very way Lucian had lived for so many years, this moment should have been the end for Gideon. A ruthless and decisive execution like the ones he had dealt to more than a few men who had dared challenge him. Everyone standing around them held their breath, waiting for the familiar nod from the crime lord, the wordless command that would wipe the enemy kneeling at his feet from existence forever. And in truth, for one moment, Lucian's rage and old instincts rose inside him with terrible force, urging him to pour down on the man who had dared touch Maggie and expose his past every measure of vengeance he deserved. His hand tightened, his eyes darkened, and the whole room seemed to sink beneath the weight of the decision about to be made. But at that very second, Lucian's gaze accidentally met Maggie's. She stood there, trembling but not looking away, watching him with eyes that held neither fear nor judgment, but a quiet faith as though she could still see inside this ruthless man, some light he himself had long since stopped believing he possessed. And at the same time, Eleanor's gentle voice echoed in his mind from those distant years, the lesson she had tried to plant inside his young heart when he was a boy, that true strength didn't lie in making people terrified, but in knowing when to stop, that no matter how deep a person had sunk into darkness, he could still choose not to become the cruelest thing in it. Lucian stood motionless, and in that torn and suspended moment, he realized that if he ended Gideon right then, he would defeat his enemy, but he would lose himself forever. He would betray everything the woman had sacrificed her whole life to protect inside him, and he would stain the trusting gaze that decent young woman was giving him. And so, slowly, Lucian loosened his clenched hand, and he made a choice that perhaps even the man he had been only a few months earlier could never have imagined. He didn't kill Gideon. Instead, he decided to bring down his empire in another way, coldly, but without staining his hands with innocent blood. With all his power, his network, and the evidence his people had quietly gathered, Lucian dragged every one of Gideon's crimes into the light, handed him and the accusing files over to the very forces Gideon had spent his whole life trying to avoid, so that he would pay for what he had done according to the law. Instead of disappearing in silence as one more secret of the underworld, the empire Gideon had worked so hard to build collapsed completely. His illegal operations were exposed and erased, and Gideon himself lost everything, not beneath the brutal hand of another crime lord, but beneath the weight of his own sins. When Lucian walked out of the warehouse with Maggie into the first light of dawn breaking along the horizon, he felt that something inside his chest had changed forever. The ice that had sealed his heart for 20 years, the cold shell he had built from the day he believed he had been abandoned, had finally begun to melt, and the person who had made that miracle happen hadn't done it with power or violence, but only with a heart that refused to harden. It was the poor girl walking quietly beside him. Just as dawn began to break, Maggie suddenly remembered her promise to the old woman and the card she had been carefully keeping in her coat pocket. She turned to Lucian, her eyes still red, and in a trembling voice, she told him that someone had asked her to place something directly in his hands, someone who was waiting for him at the end of the road. She took out the card, yellowed by the years, and placed it in his hand. Lucian stared at the card in stunned silence, and when he opened it, when his eyes touched the shaky, crooked lines written inside, his whole body seemed to turn to stone. It was a handwriting he could never mistake. The same handwriting that had once written his name on little scraps of paper tucked into the pockets of the boy he had been, the handwriting of the only woman who had ever loved him without condition. In the card, in simple words soaked with love, Eleanor told him that she had never abandoned him, that every day for the past 20 years she had thought of him, and that if he was reading these lines, she begged him to believe that he had always been the good boy she loved most in the world. Lucian jerked his head up, his voice choking as he asked Maggie where the person who had given her this card was, and when she gave him the name and address of her small rented room, a terrible truth burst open in his mind. The old woman on the street corner whom Maggie had been caring for, the disabled woman he had recognized through the old coin, was Eleanor, his nanny, and she was dying. He ran as he had never run for anything in his life, leaving behind all his power and his familiar composure, until he was only a man racing against time to reclaim the most precious thing he had thought he had lost forever. When he pushed open the door to the tiny rented room and stepped inside, Eleanor was lying there, fragile as the last leaf of autumn, her breath barely more than a faint thread. She slowly opened her cloudy gray eyes, and when her gaze touched the face of the man kneeling beside the bed, a weak smile bloomed on her pale lips. "My boy," she whispered, lifting a trembling hand to touch his face as though to make sure this wasn't a dream. Lucian took that hand, pressed it against his cheek, and for the first time since becoming the most powerful man in Chicago, he cried like a child, the tears he had imprisoned for 20 years finally breaking loose. He placed in her palm the old worn coin he had guarded all those years, the coin she had given to the boy he used to be, and when she recognized it, tears gathered in her eyes. "You kept it all these years," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Lucian nodded, choking out that he had never let it leave him, that he had misunderstood her his entire life, and that he was sorry for ever having resented her. Eleanor gave a faint shake of her head and told him there was nothing for him to apologize for. Then her eyes moved to Maggie, who stood quietly crying beside them, and back again to the face of the man she had protected when he was a child. "I was afraid life would turn you into a cruel man," she whispered. But now, seeing you, seeing the way you stand beside this girl, I know the seed of kindness I planted inside you all those years ago never truly died. You're still my good-hearted boy. Now I can be at peace." She looked at both of them one last time, her eyes filled with peace and fulfillment, then slowly closed them, and her fragile breath softly faded into the room, leaving this world in the arms of the child she had sacrificed her whole life to protect. Lucian lowered his head onto her hand as it slowly grew cold, his shoulders shaking with sobs, while Maggie quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. Two people who had once been strangers now shared the same loss, together saying goodbye to the woman whose kindness, even after all those years, still had enough power to bind broken hearts back together. The months after Eleanor's passing moved slowly, not loudly, not brilliantly like a miracle from a fairy tale, but like a true dawn, quietly rising little by little after a very long night. Lucian Crowe was still the man who made all of Chicago cautious, but his eyes no longer held only ice. Some afternoons, he would stand for a long time before the glass window on the highest floor, looking down at the city that had once belonged to him, through other people's fear, and quietly understanding that no man could truly call himself strong if all he knew how to do was make others lower their heads. Eleanor's peaceful death in his arms hadn't taken away the last part of love inside him. Instead, it had awakened it. She was gone, but her lessons remained. In the old coin he still carried with him, in the yellowed card placed with reverence inside his private drawer, and in the small figure of Maggie, the young woman who had saved the human part of him with the very kindness she had never thought was anything extraordinary. Danny recovered day by day, like a small seedling finally touched by sunlight. His treatment progressed better than expected. His face grew rosier, his breathing was no longer as frail as before, and the hospital room that had once carried the heavy smell of antiseptic now rang with clear, bright laughter. One morning, Maggie walked in and found Danny sitting cross-legged on the bed, laughing so hard because he had drawn Lucian in a black coat, far too large for him, and with legs as long as a ladder. The boy had also drawn Maggie standing beside him, holding a soup ladle like a heroine, and above them was the purple sky he had always loved. In the corner of the picture, he had carefully written Eleanor's name in still clumsy letters. Maggie held the drawing to her chest, smiling with tears reddening her eyes, because for the first time in many years, she no longer looked at the future through the fear of hospital bills, the worry of tomorrow's meal, or the feeling that she had to fight the whole world alone. She remained humble as ever, still unused to receiving too many good things, but she had learned that sometimes allowing someone else to help was also a way of believing in kindness. Sometime later, in that same West Side neighborhood once so cold and shadowed, a small night kitchen opened on the ground floor of an old building that had been restored. On the wooden sign hanging above the door, simple words glowed beneath the warm light: Eleanor's Night Kitchen. It wasn't an elegant restaurant, with no red carpet and no expensive tables or chairs. There were only pots of hot soup, bread fresh from the oven, coffee strong enough to keep people awake through long shifts, and clean tables for dock workers, night nurses, drivers, janitors, and laborers, the people who moved through the city while the rest of the world slept. Maggie stood behind the counter, her hair tied neatly back, her smile still as gentle as it had been during those nights at Dorset's, but this time, her shoulders were no longer bowed by despair. Every bowl of soup she handed out was not only food, but a reminder that no one should be forgotten in the cold, and no one should ever have to believe their own existence was something to apologize to the world for. Lucian often stood quietly behind her, in the corner of the room where the light didn't fall too clearly. He didn't like being thanked, nor did he want anyone to know that most of the money keeping that kitchen alive came from him. He only stood there, watching Maggie bend down to ask after each person, watching Danny run between the tables, cheerfully handing crayons to another child so they could draw together, and on his cold face there would sometimes pass a very faint peace, as though he had finally understood what it meant to stand in the light without needing to possess it. On opening night, Maggie placed an empty chair in the corner of the room, draped Eleanor's old woolen shawl over it, and set a small coin in a glass frame beside it. No one needed much explanation. Those who had once been touched by her kindness understood that some people leave this world and still remain present in every good thing they leave behind. And then, on one late winter night, when the kitchen was nearly closing, Maggie looked through the glass window and saw an image that made her stand still. Across the street, a young girl in an old coat was slowly pushing a wheelchair for an elderly man over a rough stretch of sidewalk. The girl stopped, adjusted the blanket over his legs, then bent down and said something that made him laugh. No one was watching. There was no reward, no applause. Only one small, quiet, warm act in the middle of a cold night. Maggie turned to Lucian, and in his eyes, she knew he had seen it too. The circle had closed, but it hadn't ended. It had only been passed into another hand, another heart, another person choosing kindness in a world that could sometimes be far too harsh. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is very simple: that sincere kindness never truly disappears. It may sleep in the darkness for a very long time, but one day it will find its way back, healing someone, and continuing to spread farther than we can see. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so we can continue bringing you many meaningful videos every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment so we can listen to the feelings that came from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life each day, and a peaceful heart. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.